Good afternoon, everyone. I know we still have folks joining us on this webinar, and we'll give you a little bit of time, but we wanted to start on time for our webinar from the Exceptional Family Member Program, Lejeune-New. We're glad that you're joining us for this, and we do want to start on time. We want to let you know, functionality-wise, we're going to limit audio portion of it and mute all users. You can still interact with Vickie O'Brien by typing your question into the chat box, and I think that'll give us the best presentation here and give us the best audio quality for everyone. So again, we're going to mute the teleconference feature. Please use the chat box on the right side to ask any questions, and we'll try to answer those as soon as we can. So without further ado, I want to introduce Vickie O'Brien. She is the attorney for exceptional family members for Marine Corps Installations East. And we're pleased that she will be teaching us about service animals and emotional support animals. And again, we welcome your questions. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Vickie O'Brien.
Thanks, Daryl. Good afternoon, everyone. I am glad that you are joining us today. This topic has 26 slides, and I will be as quick as I can. But thankfully, this training will be, I believe, on the EFMP website or the Facebook page for you guys to access at a later date if you want to go back through it. This is a training that I actually gave back in November to some other attorneys at a continuing legal education program. So I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you are able to learn something from it today. And just know that there are resources here to help you if you run into issues that deal with service animals or emotional support animals. So to get started, I am Vickie O'Brien, and we're going to be talking a little bit today. I wanted to start with the Americans with Disability Act, which is the backdrop for so much of what we're going to be talking about today. So, of course, that's a federal law that requires state and local government agencies, businesses, and nonprofits, which are called covered entities, to basically provide goods and services and to make reasonable modifications in their policies, their practices, and procedures when necessary to accommodate people with disabilities. So there are 3 different titles to the ADA, although today we're going to talk about Title II and Title III. Title I actually deals with employment, but like I said, we're going to focus more on accessibility in public places. So I want to talk about the Title II places, which are state and local governments, your local DMV, your local Department of Social Services, things like that would fall under Title II. And Title III, we're talking about public accommodations and commercial facilities, so businesses, your grocery store, your bank, normal places that you might visit during a day. And the overarching theme of all of this is that allowing the use of service animals is in fact an accommodation that falls within this requirement. So if you are a person who needs to be assisted by an animal in public, that is an accommodation that you're asking to be made under generally the Americans with Disabilities Act. But there are other federal laws that are going to come into play. And the focus of this training is to help you understand if you do need an animal, if you do need a service animal or an emotional support animal, what your rights are and where those rights originate, and how to basically self-advocate. So I'm always here as an attorney if you have questions or if you need advocacy on those things, but this is to help you guys, when you are in public, to know what your rights are and actually what some of your responsibilities are. And I chose Lingo and the Law as a title for this because I often see people mixing up the names of service animals, emotional support animals, or misidentifying them in public or mislabeling their own animal. You'll sometimes see that in public. And I just kind of wanted to clearly define this for everyone so that when you are in public and you see someone assisted by an animal, you might be able to, identify somebody who might have mislabeled their emotional support animal, or, you'll know what to look for a true service dog. So service animals or dogs, I just wanted to go through the lingo with you guys. What's the difference between a service animal, an emotional support animal, and just generally a pet? So a service animal or dog is defined and protected by the ADA, which we just talked about, and other federal laws, which we'll get to. They are specially trained to perform tasks or work, and they are not pets. Pets are just generally for our enjoyment. They don't have any specific training. They just love us and live with us. But they are service animals are trained to perform a task specific to the disability. So emotional support animals are different, and emotional support animals really have lots of different names, and that's where it can get a little confusing because people don't necessarily understand that their support animal may not be a service animal. Um, so sometimes you'll hear people refer to a therapy dog, which has its own specific definition, a therapy animal, a companion animal, or support animal. And different federal and state laws will actually refer to emotional support animals in different terminology as well. So it can get a little confusing with the lingo and the vocabulary that's used across the board. So just wanted to point that out. Emotional support animals do provide a benefit to a person with a verified disability. Usually that benefit is comfort, emotional support, or companionship. It's not that they are specifically trained to perform a task, but they are just merely there to help comfort a person and to help that person access public places and make them feel that they can be okay in public. So generally no special training is required for an emotional support animal, although we'll talk a little bit later about why it's a good idea to have them at least partially trained. And they are not protected by the ADA. They are protected under other statutes, which we will get to as well, and emotional support animals because they do provide a benefit to a person with a disability. They are not considered pets. So, of course, our pets, they're generally not allowed in places of public accommodation, and of course, I'll point out, except the park, the vet's office, and PetSmart. so, so we don't want to get confused with what our pets are able to do for us versus animals that are needed to help a person with disabilities to access public accommodations. So a little bit more about service animals. The definition of that, of course, is provided by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it is a very specific definition, and it is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The task performed by the dog must be directly related to the person's disability. So it wouldn't make sense if you had a person who had a dog who could alert for seizures, but that person needed that person was visually impaired and needed a dog that could see for them out in public places and guide them. So if the disability doesn't match what the dog is able to do, then that doesn't necessarily make sense. So in 2011, the ADA was modified to allow miniature horses to serve as service animals. So it could be a dog or a miniature horse. I've been lucky enough to see a miniature horse once in public. It's definitely a sight to behold to see an animal assist a person who needs it. So service animals and their jobs. I put together a list of things that, we talk about animals that are trained to perform a task. Well, what sort of tasks would they need to do or need to be able to do? And I just kind of put together this list of things that you could look at. Guiding, of course, your blind or visually impaired person in their daily movement, guiding a person to a safe place in the case of a panic attack potentially, which would potentially be a psychiatric service dog. Alerting a person who has seizures or panic attacks, or alerting a person with diabetes that their sugar is low. And this is what I called grounding, which is providing a point of reference for someone who may become disoriented or suffer distress when they're out in public. Protection. They can help balance or serve as a counterweight to someone who may not be sure on their footing and may have some issues walking out in public. Or they could remove a person from harmful situations. So if there's a person who just gets disoriented in public potentially for whatever reason, the dog or the horse could come between that person in a dangerous situation, such as a moving car or a curb that they might step off of or something in that nature. Retrieving, of course, a dog or a horse could retrieve documents, identification, household items. You see that often in the case of people with physical disabilities. Reminding, dog or horse could remind a person to take their medication or to perform their activities of daily living, such as, hygiene type things if the person is unable to remember to do those things on their own. And then I put a note here that it is common for service animals to be trained to do more than one task, as long as it relates to the disability that the person has or is living with, then that falls under the definition of a service animal. Where are service animals allowed in public? Generally, service animals are allowed everywhere. The whole purpose of a service animal is to allow a person with disabilities to have equal access to public accommodations, to be able to benefit from everything in society that other people benefit from, the ability to use the stores, the banks, to get their own business done as independently as possible. So some examples, of course, I put here: restaurants, hospitals, stores, public transportation, doctor's offices, banks, governments, the DMV, schools. And there, when we have service animals in public, we sometimes run into folks who run businesses or who manage those places who aren't quite sure what the law is or may not be aware. And again, this is so that folks who have a service animal or folks who are assisting a person with a disability that might have a service animal can know their rights and know how to self-advocate. So allergies or a fear of dogs is not a legal basis to deny someone access to a certain public facility. So there are requirements, of course, if you have a service animal in public. The most important, I think, is that they must be on a leash, they must be tethered or harnessed. Unless in very specific cases, there are cases of psychiatric service animals that could help someone with PTSD, and it would make sense that that sort of animal would respond to voice commands, and they would go into a place of business or go into a room or go around corners and report back to the person who has the PTSD to let them know that that space is safe. So in that situation, you could see a service animal off of leash or tether, but that's pretty rare to see. The animal must be calm and trained for public situations. The animal can't bark, lunge, growl, attempt to bite, or do any other disruptive behavior. There, of course, with anything in the law, it's never black and white. If an animal's provoked into barking, of course, that does not mean the animal's out of control. If the animal just has some sort of reaction to something that's completely normal, that does not make them out of control and unable to be in public with the person that they are assisting. So there's always exceptions to circumstances that we have to look at, but generally just well-behaved, calm, and trained to deal with sometimes the chaos of public situations, the noise and the busyness. They must also be clean and in good health. You can't have an animal that's constantly scratching. You can't take an animal that hasn't been treated for fleas and is constantly scratching into a public restaurant, for example. That is a requirement that your dog be clean and in good health. They must be housebroken. So a person who is handling a service animal must be able to handle, those situations where their animal has to go to the bathroom in public and those sorts of situations, but the animal has to be aware that they can't go in certain places and are trained to not need to go, say when they're on an airplane or when they're in a restaurant or when they're in a place of public accommodation. So that's an important part of training as well. And of course, the person with a disability, whoever's handling the service animal, must maintain control of their animal at all times. What is not required? You'll sometimes see this on different forums, and that's part of why I wanted to do this training, is because there's a lot of misinformation out there. You are not required to put a vest, a tag on your dog, and you are not required to register and get any sort of certificate for your service animal. None of those are required in order for an animal to assist a disabled person in public. You don't have to have proof that your dog has been trained, because you don't necessarily have to send your dog to a school to be trained. You can train your dog yourself. The whole point of allowing service animals to assist people with disabilities and allow them that access is not to impose those undue burdens of cost. And so these things would definitely impose that. So we want to make sure that folks with disabilities have access to the public places without having to meet additional criteria. Now, there is a registration process in North Carolina you may hear about. It is through the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. It is a voluntary registration, and they will send you an ID card basically saying that your service animal is registered in the state of North Carolina, and a tag for your dog's collar that basically lets the public know that it is in fact a service animal. Again, not required, but sometimes if you have an animal that is marked as a service animal, then sometimes people won't ask you questions or approach you in a way that they shouldn't. So sometimes having our animals registered in that way could be a good thing. Again, it's not necessary for you to do that. It is also not required for you to go into a public place and have to disclose the nature and extent of your disability just because you're bringing a service animal into an establishment. So you can't have the manager come up to you in a restaurant and say, "Hey, why is that dog in here? What is your disability that you need this animal in here?" There are only 2 questions that you can be asked when you're in a public place regarding your need for a service animal or why you're bringing a service animal there. So the first one is the animal required because of a disability? And 2, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? So you're not having to disclose, "Oh, well, I've been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z." You don't have to report your medical information to those people. They don't have to know the exact nature of your disability. Only that your animal is required because of the disability and the job that that animal performs. So let's talk a little bit about emotional support animals now. On my slide, I have this lady on an airplane, and she's got I think it's like a pot-bellied pig. So there's been lots of stories in the press. Again, another reason why I wanted to do this training about a little bit of outrage, I think, on the part of some people about emotional support animals and what they're for, the types of animals that are used, the places that they're allowed to go to. So I just wanted to kind of point out some things so that, people could better understand what their rights are as far as emotional support animals, and just not to pay attention to those sort of more outrageous, ridiculous stories. And those are the ones that tend to get the news coverage. So
just a quick note for everyone who's tuned in, especially those who've phoned in. At the end, we are going to unmute all users towards the end of this presentation to give you an opportunity to ask questions of Vickie. So stick with us till the end, and we will unmute all users. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Emotional support animals, they also have a very specific definition. So they are animals who may not be specifically trained to perform a task or a job, but provide a benefit to a person with a verified disability. Usually, as I said before, it's comfort, emotional support, or companionship, and usually that benefit is some amelioration of some symptom of a mental health or psychiatric issue. So if there's some significant anxiety, having this animal in public may calm the person and allow them to be able to function and communicate in public and do the things that they may be unable to do without the presence of that animal. Emotional support animals, unlike under the ADA, they're not limited to dogs or miniature horses. They could include other species of animals. That also includes cats. They're sometimes referred to as companion animals, comfort animals, or therapy dogs and animals. And they are not pets. Remember, emotional support animals do provide a function. Although they're not covered by the ADA, they are covered by other federal laws. So emotional support animals in public places, they're generally not given the same access rights as service animals since they're not specifically trained to perform work or a task relating to a disability. Now, we know that our emotional support animals provide a benefit, of course, to a person with a disability. They do, some people will look at that as a task or a job, but they are treated as a separate type being under the law. Emotional support animals can be excluded from public places by law. Hotels and motels, I did some research on this, and they do view emotional support animals as pets, which again, it seems strange because to me there are three different types of animals. You have your service animals, your emotional support animals, and pets. But they do treat them as pets, and they can exclude them from the property or charge additional fees. So unlike a service animal where you cannot be charged additional fees for having and requiring the use of that animal, emotional support animals are different. So please be aware of that when you're traveling in public. Their emotional support animals can often be confused with service animals when the animal is a dog and wears a vest or official looking gear. So sometimes you might take your, if you have an emotional support animal, you might take your, and it's a dog, you might take that animal in public and no one asks a question. If you have a vest, sometimes if you don't have a vest, they will ask you questions. And generally, if you're not able to answer those service animal questions, then you may be excluded from that public place. So just be aware of that. To claim coverage under those federal laws defining and protecting emotional support animals, you will need to do the following. So it's a little bit of a different criteria than someone who needs a service animal under the ADA. In order to have an emotional support animal with you, you have to have a verifiable disability and a legitimate need for the animal. So usually what you'll need is a letter from a medical professional. That professional must have stated credentials, of course. You know, what are they, an MD? Are they a psychiatrist, a psychologist? And that letter will need to state your need for the presence of the emotional support animal. So if you are in public and someone approaches you, you know, and they see that your animal is calm and is assisting you, but they're not sure if it's a service animal or it could potentially be an emotional support animal. Sometimes if you have this letter with you, it calms the questions from those who might ask you questions about why you need this animal. So let's talk a little bit about housing. We've talked about you know, our service animals, our emotional support animals, our definitions, public accommodations, and things like that. But housing is different. So under the Fair Housing Act, which is, it's a federal law prohibiting discrimination from people against people with physical and mental disabilities. It also requires landlords to provide reasonable accommodations to allow assistance animals to reside in the residence. So the FHA is not as restrictive as the ADA. So under fair housing, you could have a service animal or an emotional support animal, because both of those fall into the definition of what an assistance animal is. So even though in public places you might be given a hard time regarding your emotional support animal, under the Fair Housing Act, you are entitled by law to live with that animal if you have that verifiable need and that animal assists you in some way and provides that benefit to you. So be aware of that. So when we're talking about housing, what documentation, because sometimes this becomes an issue, what documentation is required when requesting a reasonable accommodation for a service animal or an assistance animal? So I put together some information here for you guys. If the disability is known or obvious, you know, if you are partially sighted or visually impaired in some way, and you come into the housing office of an apartment complex and you have a service dog with you, and you know it's obvious that dog is guiding you, there may not be any further questions regarding your need for that animal. But if you have a disability that may not be readily apparent or known to the provider of the housing, they might ask you to submit reliable documentation of a disability and the disability related need for an assistance animal. So just be aware that you may have to provide a letter from a medical provider that explains how the reasonable accommodation helps, which is the reasonable accommodation being the presence of the animal, helps or mitigates symptoms of the disability. So just be aware that in certain situations we may have to provide documentation regarding the need for that animal with us. Um, Housing, again, what does a housing provider need to consider in order to determine if the request for accommodation is reasonable? Again, the request for accommodation that you're seeking is the presence and the assistance of your service animal or your assistance animal, which could also include your emotional support animal. There are two questions that really the housing provider has to look at. One, does a person seeking to use and live with the animal have a disability, which is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? Or two, does the person making the request have a disability-related need for an assistance animal? So in other words, does the animal work, provide assistance, perform tasks or services for the benefit of a person with a disability, or provide emotional support that alleviates one or more of the identified symptoms or effects of a person's existing disability? So if the answer to both of those questions, and number two is lengthy, I'm sorry, if the answer to both of those are yes, then the landlord must accommodate you in having your assistance animal live with you in the housing. The flip side of that is, when does a landlord not have to accommodate an assistance animal? So if your animal would impose an undue financial or administrative burden, or it would fundamentally alter the nature of the housing provider's services, or the specific assistance animal in question poses a direct threat to the health, safety, and others that cannot be reduced or eliminated by another reasonable accommodation, or the specific animal in question would cause a substantial physical damage to the property of others that cannot be reduced or eliminated by another reasonable accommodation. So if you, it's hard to think of a situation where having a service animal would fundamentally alter the nature of the housing provider's services. And then having an animal that poses a direct threat. Now, when we get into, when we think about and talk about emotional support animals, those animals sometimes do not have training to perform those specific tasks. They may not have a lot of public type situational training. So it depends again on the situation. And you could see an animal that could potentially be very protective of the person that they provide that comfort and companionship to. So if you have a dog that snaps and bites at everyone except for its handler, then that could potentially cause an issue, and the landlord could ask that that animal not live on the premises. So training is sometimes very important. As far as causing substantial physical damage to the property, I suppose if you live in a one-bedroom apartment and you try to have a miniature horse, it might cause issues with some damage if the animal didn't have enough room to move around, that sort of situation. But generally these things, these are rare circumstances, and most of the time the landlord is going to find a way or is going to be required to accommodate your service animal or your emotional support animal. So housing, and this is called restrictions on restrictions, because we want to talk about what can't be done. So if the accommodation is required, so meaning under the law, you are you will have your service animal or your emotional support animal with you. The landlord may not do certain things. They cannot deem the service or assistance of the animal, the service animal or the assistance animal, a pet and deny access. So they can't say, oh, I think your emotional support animal is just a pet, and we're not going to allow your pet to live here. So I have seen that at Base Legal. We have had people come in who had actual pets, but then they had another dog that was actually a service dog or an emotional support animal, and maybe in that apartment complex they could only have one pet per se. Well, they only had one pet, but then they also had their support animals. So we have had trouble with landlords understanding those that criteria and those nuances in the law. So a landlord cannot charge you fees in order to allow the assistance animal to reside with you. So that's very important. They can't say, oh, well, we we have a normal pet deposit fee of $300, and I'm going to charge you an extra $350 for your service dog. No, they can't do that. They can't outright restrict a certain breed of service animal or assistance animal because the pets of that breed are not allowed. We run into this when we see a pit bull type dog as a service animal, or maybe a Rottweiler. Maybe in that apartment or that housing area, the landlord doesn't allow those types of breeds. But when when it is a service animal or support animal, you are protected by federal and state law. That does not limit the breed of animal that you use as your support. So just keep that in mind as well. Your landlord also can't provide certification of training. Again, under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, they can't come to you and say, well, I need proof that your dog is actually trained. Well, what we learned earlier in what we were talking about with service dogs was that you can train service dogs yourself if you find that necessary. We don't want costs to prohibit people from being able to have access to the public through the use of service animals. So requiring that certification is not allowed, and they can't restrict you from having housing or enjoying the premises or signing a lease there just because you don't have certification of training. Another thing that I see often on online forums, which can be the worst sometimes. Everybody's an expert, I guess. But you'll see people who will talk about an experience that they had with an airline, and they'll say, oh well, they violated my rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, no, because the ADA does not regulate air travel. So the most important part of being able to self-advocate is knowing which laws apply to which situations. So in this situation, I want you guys to be aware of the Air Carrier Access Act. That is what is going to regulate air travel for people with disabilities. So the ACAA, it does prohibit discrimination against passengers with physical and or mental disabilities, and it requires passenger airlines to provide reasonable accommodations to the disabled to include travel with service animals or emotional support animals. So the ACAA does apply to all flights in the United States and flights to and from the U.S. by foreign airlines. So they also fall under this federal law, and they have to implement the same law. So just remember that the ADA is not going to regulate your air travel, but it does regulate the airports, the shuttles, those public accommodations, and other public facilities and activities surrounding the air travel. So once you get onto the plane, you're covered by the ACAA, but while you're on the ground and while you're in the terminal and while you're using the desks, if you need accommodations for communication, that sort of thing, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, does in fact cover you. So under the ACAA, a service animal is defined as any animal that is individually trained or able to provide assistance to a person with a disability, or any animal that assists persons with disabilities by providing emotional support. So as you can see, the ACAA does cover what is considered a service animal under the ADA definition, and it also covers emotional support animals. So in that definition that we gave earlier. So the ACAA does apply to both of those. So just be aware of your rights when flying as far as the application of that. So as far as air travel, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because there are a lot. Sometimes there are a lot of hoops to jump through, and we need to know what we have to provide and what we don't need to provide, and how to self-advocate. So there is no documentation of need for a service animal. So let's talk about service animals, or training required. Airlines encourage paperwork to be completed in advance, but it is not required. So just be aware of that. But for pragmatic, practical use of the airport and knowing that you're flying somewhere and knowing you're going to have to get this stuff done as far as paperwork, it's always a good idea to do it in advance. That just makes sense. You don't have to provide advance notice to the airline that you're traveling with a service animal or an assistance animal. But for certain foreign flights or maybe a lengthy flight, you might want to give advance notice to the airline. Airlines determine whether an animal is a service animal by a couple of ways, which is the credible verbal assurances of an individual with a disability using the animal. And remember those two ADA questions we talked about in places of public accommodation. Is your animal required because of a disability, and what tasks or job is your animal trained to perform? So those two questions. They could look for physical indicators such as the presence of a harness or tags. Again, you're not required to have these things on your animal. They're not required, but sometimes they are helpful when you're in a public place. I do tend to find, because people like to try to pet service animals or emotional support animals, and we know that while they're working, they should not be put into positions where they can be hugged on and loved on and petted and distracted from their jobs. So sometimes having those vests that tell people that it is a service animal, do not pet, is helpful. Um, and the airline can also just observe the behavior of the animal. So if your animal is calm, is sitting by your side, is on a tether or a harness, and they look at the way that that animal is assisting you, that's going to let them know without any further documentation or requirements or questions that that animal is assisting you. So if you have any other questions about that and you need further information, of course, the transportation.gov website is really an excellent resource to use. It's the U.S. Department of Transportation, where you can find out all of those criteria, all of those sorts of things that may or may not happen in an airport. So when we're talking about emotional support animals that also fall under that ACAA for air travel, there is some documentation that you're going to have. So just be aware of this when you're attempting to fly with an emotional support animal. You're most likely going to need documentation not more than 1 year old, and provide advance notice to the airline of your intent to travel. This is almost always required for emotional support or psychiatric service animals. That documentation would include a letter, which is provided by a mental health professional with stated credentials, which back when we were talking about the definition of an emotional support animal in the beginning of the training, we talked about this letter provided by a doctor or a mental health professional with those credentials. It needs to state that the passenger is under their care and suffers from an emotional or mental disability as defined in the DSM. And that the passenger requires an emotional support animal or a psychiatric service animal as an accommodation in order to travel. So if you have those things, you should have no problem boarding an airline with your emotional support animal. But it is an extra hoop that you have to jump through that you don't necessarily have to jump through when you have a service dog. So some airlines also are now requiring vaccination records and some certification of training and a passenger liability form. And I think the reason for this, and this applies to the emotional support animals, I think the reason for this is, again, we go back to those kind of outrageous news stories that we've seen. You know, the lady trying to board a flight with a peacock when the airline had already kind of told her in advance she wasn't going to be able to fly with that sort of animal, just because of the logistics of doing that. And animals that could potentially bite or attack other people, that don't have that sort of training to be, to remain calm in those enclosed spaces. So the airlines have to balance, of course, their liability and, with other passengers, with, trying to accommodate those people with disabilities. So they are putting some parameters in place. So just be aware that there's some extra documentation that you might need. So every airline is going to have those requirements posted on their website. So definitely before you fly, make sure you check out their website and find out what you're going to need in advance, and try to get that done in advance as far as notice. When we're talking about access rights to air travel, I just want to make you aware of rights, so that if you run into an issue while you have your assistance animal with you, just know how to how to respond to it. So just know that you can't be charged additional fees for requesting a service animal or an emotional support animal accommodation. The airline can't charge you for an extra seat. They can't charge you some weird pet fee, pet travel fee. So just know that you should be able to, you will be able to travel with that animal without additional fees. So the airline also cannot refuse to allow you to travel with your service animal or emotional support animal just because it makes other passengers or crew uncomfortable. So again, service animals are defined as a dog, of course, or a miniature horse, and emotional support animals can be any number of different species of animals. So as far as airlines, some types of animals may be prohibited as far as their definition of an emotional support animal. So if it's a snake, if it's a certain rodent, if it's a spider, if it's those kinds of things, it may provide comfort or companionship to the person with a disability, but they may not be allowed to fly with that sort of animal. So just be aware that there are some restrictions sometimes on species and types. But just because it you know, if you have an animal such as a cat, if it makes the flight attendant uncomfortable in any way, that is not a reason for them to not allow you to have your service animal or your ESA on that flight. If there's a dispute regarding your service animal or emotional support animal, you can make that known to your flight attendant or somebody in the terminal. And the airline must provide a CRO, which is a complaints resolution official. And that person is supposed to be a disability accommodations expert to assist with resolving the issue. So that's kind of like a liaison type person who's going to find out what the problem is, find out why the airline is refusing to accommodate, and figure out if there's some sort of middle ground to allow the person to fly with the animal. So be aware that you do have that on site, on location. So if you run into issues, you know what to ask for. So as far as air travel, again, just be aware that the requirements are becoming more stringent and specific due to the dramatic increase of passengers traveling with emotional support animals of varying species. Again, some of the news stories that come out, the airlines respond to that. And so they put up new and interesting barriers. So we need to find out what those are, and we need to try to challenge those or comply with those as necessary. So again, checking with each individual carrier before you travel, making sure that you don't show up to the airport with, say, a sloth and you're denied the ability to board because that happens to be on the list of prohibited emotional support animals. So I made just a little list here. I did just a quick little survey of a couple of airlines, and Delta has actually banned pit bull type dogs as service animals or emotional support animals on their flights. So just be aware of that. If you do have a service animal that is that kind of breed, you may have some difficulty flying with Delta, so you may have to choose an entirely different carrier. Southwest now only recognizes dogs and cats as emotional support animals. And then, of course, there's limits to the number of animals that you are allowed to travel with. So most are only allowing one emotional support animal, or service animal per person. So be aware of that. The last thing I wanted to talk about, it's not on the slides here, but I just kind of went through all the federal laws that apply. But North Carolina itself, and each state that you guys might travel to or live in, they're going to have specific laws relating to people with disabilities. North Carolina law that applies in these situations, it actually it's North Carolina General Statutes, Chapter 168, and that addresses persons with disabilities. And in that 168-4.5, we talk about the fact that people can be actually held criminally responsible of a Class 3 misdemeanor if they do the following things. And this can be anyone in a public accommodation, anyone who is interfering with your right to access public accommodations. So But also, if you try to disguise a service animal, disguise just a regular pet as a service animal, that is in fact a class 3 misdemeanor. Um, or if you have a person out in the public who's trying to deprive you of a right to use, of course, your service animal, or charges you a fee to use public services, that's also a class 3 misdemeanor. So if you run into situations, there are remedies that you can explore. Of course, one of them is the criminal route, which of course you could go to the local magistrate and talk to them about having a person charged with interfering with your public access rights and your ability to use your service animal or your emotional support animal in public. Um, but also, there are complaints that you can file at the federal level, which would be filed with the Office of Civil Rights. We would file those under Title II or Title III, again, which is what this training is kind of focused on, to have those places basically investigated to find out if they have practices that are widespread. They could potentially be fined. There's a number of things that could happen regarding your complaint that could assist others also in the community. So be aware that you can file those complaints, and there's different types of relief that we can ask for. I can assist you with that. So if there's an issue with service animal or emotional support animal use and you find the need to file a complaint, I can certainly assist you with that. Other resources I want you guys to be aware of would be the ADA.gov website, of course, which is your Americans with Disabilities Act page. And that gives you all, it has a frequently asked questions page. There's lots of really good information on there that sort of reiterates what I've said today, but just tells you specifically if you're out in public and you forget something that I've said today, and you want to know, hey, can this person charge me a fee to allow my service animal in this restaurant? Just pull that up quickly on your phone, or have somebody assist you with that, of course. The North Carolina Disability Rights page is full of lovely information. I actually use their page myself from time to time when I'm trying to put certain things together in an orderly fashion. They actually have 17 articles on service and support animals, and they have some amazing self-advocacy resources. Part of that is letters you could write regarding, your landlord if there's a problem with your assistance animal. Letters that you could write to employers or just anyone else that may give you a hard time regarding this topic, this issue. So just want to make you guys aware of that, that those are things that you can use apart from my legal services, of course. But I am here to assist you, and I hope that you will use me as a resource if you need it. Thank you.
And thank everyone for joining us. We are going to unmute all users, give you a few seconds to adjust to that, but we are going to unmute for any questions that you might have. Well, you may have to press 0 if you wish to ask a question. You're going to need to press 0 when we unmute.
Yes, this is Sonia Dillard. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Hi, Ms. Dillard?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
We often hear that the law is different on base. Is that true, or on a federal on federal grounds, as far as what they can allow and can't allow? Can you provide some insight into that?
So this is an interesting thing. And when I started working on base 10 years ago, it was shocking to me as well. So that federal laws generally don't apply to the federal government. How funny is that?
Wow.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act does not apply, but only in very limited and specific circumstances to the federal government itself. So if you'll notice, Title I is employment, Title II is state and local governments, and Title III is public accommodations. So it gets to be very interesting that the federal government's not included in that. So on base, though, what I've learned is that the base does accommodate, and they do follow the parameters of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504, which is your anti-discrimination federal law, and providing basically equal services, to those with disabilities. Those things are applied to the base, but they are done through DoD instruction. So it's just kind of a roundabout way of doing it. So you basically still have a right to accommodation, reasonable accommodations when you ask for it on base, but it's sort of a different process and a different way of asking and a different authority. So I hope that that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
You're able to hear me. I wasn't able to see any of the slides because for some reason it wouldn't let me get through. So pardon me if I asked the question that was on the slide. But if you have a psychological disability, are you still able to get a regular disability animal, or are you limited to get an emotional support animal?
So that's going to depend. If your animal is performing a specific task and is trained to perform a specific task, like I was saying in the event of the person with PSD, where they have a dog run ahead and clear corners and look around the room to make sure it's safe and to report back. That is really what's called a psychiatric service animal. And so those are animals that could potentially fall into the ESA category, or they could fall into the service animal category. It just depends on whether they're trained and what their job is, or if they are there to just sort of calm the anxiety, or something along those lines. So it gets a little murky when it's more of a mental health issue. So I'm not sure if that's helpful. I mean, you can
okay.
train a dog. You can train a dog to provide, to help provide you the comfort and support, which would make it fall into an emotional support category. But if they perform a specific job or task for you, then that's when it crosses the line into service animal territory. So it just depends on the nature of the mental health disability and what the animal is used for.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Any other questions out there?
If anyone else has a question, just press 0. You should be able to unmute your phone, wherever you're calling from, and you could ask your question now. Okay, so if you had a little, we have one I think trying to ask a question. If you had trouble seeing the slides, we will have this presentation up on our website, and we'll make sure to provide links to that on our Facebook page as well. We'll try to get the visual of this presentation out to you as well. But I do thank you for joining us via phone, and if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to your caseworker or connect with the Exceptional Family Member Program's Facebook page, or connect with Vickie O'Brien, as she's provided her contact information there. So one more thank you to her for joining us, and we hope you join us for the next one. Bye.